Hello and welcome to The Edition from The Spectator. I'm Lara Prendergast, The Spectator's executive editor, and the latest issue of the magazine has just gone to press. To discuss what's in it, I'm joined now by our political editor, Tim Shipman, our associate editor and columnist, Toby Young, and the broadcaster and former Downing Street Director of Communications, Guto Harri. This week's cover has the headline, "The End is Keir," and in it, Tim takes a look at where things started to go wrong for Starmer. So, Tim, where did they?
Well, they've gone wrong almost everywhere along the line. We've got "The End is Keir," and the headline inside is "Keir and Loathing," and I think that sums up what's basically been going on for the last 18 months. He's just had the most difficult week of his premiership. He's lost his chief of staff, his director of communications and his cabinet secretary. We're told he's full of beans and roaring to continue, let Keir be Keir. But the problem is, as this piece explores, and this is the biggest piece I've written for The Spectator since I got here, the man himself appears to be, according to all the people I've spoken to, lacking the basic tenets of how to be a prime minister. And the problems have been there since even before the general election campaign. They basically entered Downing Street with no plan. This is kind of well known, but there's a lot of extra detail here on what was going on. McSweeney tries to sort of create, Morgan McSweeney, the chief of staff who's just gone, tries to create this sort of a programme for Starmer once he's put in charge. But Starmer is sort of lacking political ideas, a political kind of backbone. You've got all sorts of extraordinary revelations. And the thing that's most surprising about this, and I did it on purpose because I wanted to ensure that all the trolls on Twitter who turn around and say, oh, this is a wicked right-wing publication that's just being rude about the Prime Minister. Every single quote in this piece, some of which are extraordinarily damning, is from someone in Labour, either working for or has previously worked for Starmer or in and around the government, the party. There's a couple of civil servants in there as well. But these are all Starmer people, and they all say that he travels lightly, he's not got much ideological clue, he's incurious about the state of the world. I mean, even before they fell out, Peter Mandelson was going around telling people that not once when Starmer went to Washington did he even ask his ambassador, what do you really think this Trump fella's like? What's he going to be like in the room? How should I approach it? How might he respond to this? Which is a sort of level of kind of detachment that's amazing. Ministers say they never get an email or a call at 7 o'clock on Monday morning saying, I've been thinking about this over the weekend, we've got to do this, we've got to do that. You know, I mean, as Guto will confirm, even Boris Johnson was doing that. He wasn't always thinking about policy over the weekend. He had lots of other things in his life. But those calls would still go in to people in Downing Street. Starmer doesn't do that. We don't hear from him from Friday lunchtime till Monday morning, they say. The thing that, I mean, there are lots of telling quotes in this. The one, I guess, that is my favourite is that Starmer is obsessed with smart casual outfits in his meetings. And apparently messages go out the night before insisting that everybody turns up in smart casual. Now, I'm told this means for the Prime Minister and Richard Herman and people like that, a lot of Paul Smith, polo shirts and naff jackets and all the rest of it. But the idea that the Prime Minister is more interested in smart casual clothing than the contents of these meetings is quite telling. And a lot of the critics, I think, would say, you know, this is a government that is effectively the embodiment of beige chinos, really, when it comes to it. And there's lots more there about, you know, what happened with McSweeney, how they fell out dramatically, much further ago, I think, than everybody thinks.
At Philip Morris International, we're delivering a smoke-free future today. Our ambition is to replace cigarettes with better, smoke-free alternatives for legal-age consumers, and we're making significant progress. Learn more at pmi.com/progress.
When Starmer gave that speech on migration, talking about the island of strangers, he withdrew all that a month later. And nobody in Number 10 knew that he was upset about the phrase. He went running off to his biographer, Tom Baldwin, thought he was having a quiet drink and revealed that to the world. That was the first anyone in Downing Street had heard about it. And the sort of rage and hurt that they were all chucked under the bus, the people who'd actually been trying to create a kind of political programme and a mission for a man who doesn't seem to have it, the real hurt there that he'd kind of just abandoned them is pretty profound. And I think it's been on the cards ever since then. When it all blew up last September, people in Number 10 thought McSweeney was going to have to go immediately, and they were frantically planning, what do we do if the Tories demand the publication of all these documents? And then recess happened for conference, and we came back, and then there was a huge row about the Chinese spy case, and everyone forgot about it. And it was only when they got more information in February. So McSweeney might well have gone 4 or 5 months ago, but actually didn't. So there's been a lot of simmering tension in there that we've not heard about before, along with all the, him bowing down to the left of the party on welfare and all the rest of it, some of which is a well-trodden path. But I'd say there are lots of details in all these areas that people have not had before, and it's a pretty damning indictment of how the Prime Minister does his business, really.
Yeah, you won't enjoy reading it. Guto, you were Director of Communications during the end of Boris Johnson's government.
I've got the scars on my back.
Yeah. What are your reflections on what's happening to Keir Starmer's government right now?
I remember what it's like to be in a room not completely unlike this. It was the small crowd who trust each other intimately like us, but feeling claustrophobic and actually almost literally struggling to breathe because there's so much going on. The telly is on and you see rumours that cabinet ministers are coming to knock on the door of number 10 and the BBC tells you that they're all coming to demand his resignation. There's some of them are coming to say, don't go. And so it's all swirling around. It's very hard to calm yourself down. And anyone who works for an emergency service, for instance, will tell you the first thing to do when you turn up at the scene is you never see an ambulance driver run towards, a crash. They always park up the vehicle and they walk slowly to let the adrenaline dissipate, to clear the head and to try and think clearly. And that's very hard to do. And that's what I was thinking on Sunday. What must it feel like when Morgan McSweeney goes and he has, as this piece brilliantly sort of articulates, he's been doing the thinking for Keir since he got there. He doesn't seem to be thinking for himself. The lack of curiosity is the most extraordinary thing. Yeah. It's and maybe as journalists, curiosity is one of the things we value most and one of the things we're most captivated by. So somebody who's not remotely curious it's a nightmare. And then Tim Allen, what a dirty, doing a dirty on a Monday morning, just when you need your director of comms more than anything else, just to try and at least get something out the door. He walks away and posts that he's gone off to play golf. I wonder if his clients will ever sort of ponder in future if he's going to be there when they need them. But no, I don't envy the humanity of it all is brutal. And I actually felt quite sorry for Keir Starmer on Sunday night and Monday. By now, it's, I share everyone else's frustration that somehow when the opportunity was there, they didn't quite just push him with, didn't even need the index finger. A little finger would have pushed him over the ledge. And they somehow missed the moment.
The impression you get from Tim's piece, Toby, is of a man who hates the politics of politics, really. He doesn't seem to enjoy any of it. Is that sort of fair? I mean, what do you make of that, Toby?
When Keir Starmer famously announced on the steps of Downing Street, the beginning of his premiership, that he would govern unburdened by doctrine, and that's how he was going to differentiate himself from his ideologically bound predecessors. I thought, we've heard this before. He's under the guise of technocratic managerialism going to introduce all these incredibly contentious, radical progressive policies, like has happened in the EU, under the guise of simply being led by the evidence and so forth. All kinds of radical progressive policies have been introduced: mass immigration, gender self-ID, banning of misinformation and disinformation on social media, all under the guise of just evidence-led technocratic managerialism. So I thought, he's just pulling a fast one. We've seen this before, we've heard this before. But actually, it seems Starmer is so naive, he didn't realise that was a fig leaf under which you then kind of introduce your strongly ideologically driven left-wing agenda. He actually believed that you can govern unburdened by doctrine and that you can make policy decisions purely on the basis of evidence without referencing ideology or deep-seated political values. And that seems to be partly why he's come unstuck. He's discovered that actually you need a political agenda, you need to be immersed in politics, you need an ideology in order to be effective Prime Minister.
I think it goes back to what he did for most of his life. As a barrister, you take a brief. And if you think of the last 18 months, or I can argue the case against lifting the cap on child benefit. I'll do that this week because that's my brief. Next week, I'll argue the opposite because that's the brief that week. I can argue all the things that he's changed his mind on seem natural to him because this is what he's done. He's not joined the dots. And in politics, you have to join the dots. You have to see that you can't do this brief one week and the other the following week and be applauded as a mercenary barrister just taking the fee for it. It's actually a massive weakness. And that's why I think is people have ended up frustrated that he doesn't stand for anything, that there's no sense of what he wants to achieve. And the British public see this government as completely vacuous and yet damaging.
I mean, two quotes here that kind of sum up what we're talking about. You know, he was perfectly capable of thinking that ID cards are terrible and then that ID cards are wonderful and must be compulsory, and then that they mustn't be compulsory. Because these to him were all logical positions based on, you know, he's completely incurious, he's not interested in policy or politics, he thinks his job is to sit in a room and be serious and be presented with something and say yes or no, invariably yes, rather than be persuader in chief. And that is the job of the Prime Minister. You've got this bully pulpit. Whatever the sort of value of all those technocratic decisions, unless you take the public with you and give them some sense that you are taking them somewhere, everything just looks piecemeal and erratic, and you are very quickly taken over by events. People say Starmer's not a reader. He's got no hinterland. I mean, I think, you know, of people like him who are happy to contribute to books like the ones that I and other journalists write, explaining what's happened in politics. They're happy to put their side of it, but they don't seem to read them and realise that successful leaders have a plan, have a path to get there, and have the ability to take people with them. And Starmer has neither a plan nor apparently the ability to take people with him. And it's, you know, he's almost the most underpowered of all the last sort of 6 or 7 prime ministers.
Can I ask a follow-up question there, Tim? I think it's not enough, I don't think, to say you're astonished. I want to know more about that absence. I mean, it's absolutely clear, if you look back over 25 years, successful prime ministers have come into office with a plan, a plan rooted in a semi-coherent belief system linked to a vision. The last prime minister to have something like a plan was David Cameron. He had to modify it a bit when he went into coalition with the Lib Dems. Theresa May, no plan, came a cropper. Boris Johnson, maybe a bit of a plan, derailed by the pandemic, eventually comes a cropper. Liz Truss, Rishi Sunak, no plan. You would have thought it would be obvious to Keir Starmer, particularly after so long in opposition, that they needed a plan. They needed to have thought about what they were going to do, particularly in their first 100 days. You say in your piece that, well, that was outsourced to Sue Gray, who did sweet FA. Why did she do so little? Why did they think that they could outsource it to her, and also with such little notice?
I mean, I was limited on space, but I think it's fair. I think, well, I was actually. This piece could easily have been twice as long. Slight tensions internally about what time I filed today. I think Sue Gray's view was, we've had all this upheaval, let's just return to the civil service running everything. She didn't sort of approach it in a political way. She thought she'd been hired to sort of be, an experienced Whitehall hand and a grown-up. But her essential view was freeze out the political aides, which annoyed all of them, of course. You remember she basically capped their pay and didn't tell people even until the day that they were going into Downing Street whether they had jobs or not. The whole thing was hugely chaotic. And it suited. Starmer has this weird view that you sort of delegate. You tell someone to go and I guess when he was Director of Public Prosecutions, if he said to a bunch of people, you go away and run that case, they would actually go away and run it and come back with a result and all the rest of it. But in politics, the guy at the top is the authority. He's the driver. He's the person who can make something happen. You know, there's a quote in here about how even Rishi Sunak used to go around the building and, like, he'd go to the policy unit and say, well, you know, how are we getting on with this? You know, and this, and we've got to do something about this. Arguably, he wasn't very effective at all of that. But Starmer doesn't do that at all. He sort of sits in his room waiting for these things to happen and then is surprised when they don't. And there are all sorts of things that he felt were sort of dealt with, like, oh, well, we've said we'll raise defence spending at some point on the Never Never. That's all fine. And then he's surprised when the chiefs turn around and say, well, actually, we haven't got enough money at the moment, and now you're saying you want to go and send troops to Ukraine. Well, we can't do that, and we've told you can't do that, and you're still announcing it, because he can't compute, and he gets furious about the fact that the system isn't working for him. I think the lesson of this, which perhaps I should have spelled out more clearly, I think any Labour candidate who thinks that they want to replace Keir Starmer, and they've probably got a bit of time now. Starmer and his team effectively shored him up earlier this week when it looked like everything might fall over. They've bought until after the by-election, perhaps until after May, before this all kicks off again. They've got time to go and have a think about what it is they stand for and what they want to do. You know, what does Angela Rayner want? What does Wes Streeting want? What do any of the other contenders actually think they can contribute here? And the same goes for the Tories if they're hoping one day to get back into power. And I think most acutely for Reform, who at the moment look like they're in a position to win the next election. And they are actually doing this work. We've written about that before. They know that if they go in, they will have a very small window of opportunity to achieve something proper. And they're desperate to have that plan in place by the end of this year. And I think Starmer is it's almost like a sort of masterclass in how not to do it. And, people in number 10 say, oh, well, Keir can turn it around. Keir is going to be Keir now, and that'll be fine. But being Keir means being much more left-wing than Morgan McSweeney wanted him to be, detaching yourself from the mainstream views of the British public. And if being Keir is embracing all this sort of detachment, then that's not a way to achieve anything anyway. And, the final quote of this piece sums up, I think, the view of most of the people I spoke to, which is, we have nothing to fear but Keir himself.
Guto, I just want to ask you one more quote in here, which I think is my favourite bit of the piece, which is where you talk about the government's original sin was telling everyone that things are going to get worse.
Yeah.
And indeed, they have seemed to have got worse. But do you think that negative messaging was always going to be a problem for Keir Starmer's government?
Yeah, I mean, it kind of worked when George Osborne came in and said, oh, shock horror, look at the mess Gordon Brown has left us. That worked for a while quite well. But on this occasion, it didn't work because A, people are a bit more suspicious. B, you could see that a little bit like John Major in a funny sort of way in the last 2 years, Rishi Sunak had actually got inflation, for instance, down from double digits to 2%. So people are not that stupid.
It's also not Labour's brand.
When
George Osborne did it, it's kind of the Tory brand to say, there's all been all this terrible spending, we need to rein it in. People elect Labour governments to make them feel better and to go and do good things. And
actually, she talked down the economy, which destroyed business confidence. Yep. She then went and hit the economy with even more tax rises than she complained the Tories had left behind. And then the key decisions that annoyed her own side we're all very familiar with, but the key decisions that did real damage to the economy was terrible, and they never joined the dots on this. And then what's happened is that there was, I think, a roadmap in Morgan McSweeney's head, and maybe it could work when you have a blank canvas like Keir Starmer. If you've got total control over him and you are the puppeteer, you can make that work. But in the end, the authority comes from Keir Starmer, and he didn't assert that authority on the parliamentary party, which Morgan McSweeney couldn't do. So once the parliamentary party starts, filleting your programme, by taking out welfare reform, leaving a bill over there, and taking out this, leaving a bill over there, and doing this. That's how he's ended up in a position where he can't do anything.
It's a fundamental lack of understanding about what power is and how you use it. Yeah. And the best politicians, they do read a bit of history. They do read Robert Caro on LBJ, or they read books about Churchill or Gladstone or Pitt the Younger.
Write books about them.
Or they write books about them, yes. Some people write books about Churchill in the hope that we will see them as Churchill. But even then, it's a very readable book.
Yeah.
Obviously, people are now talking about what comes next.
Yeah.
And in the magazine this week, we have Travis Arrow writing about Al Carns, who now is being talked about as a potential contender. Who is he, for people who might not be aware?
Well, he is a former Royal Marine in his mid-40s, was quite an important chap in the Special Forces. He's a proper soldier. And he's a member of the New Intake. And I think some of the New Intake kind of look around and think, look at all these retreads having a go. Yes, Wes Streeting's a slightly fresher face, but people were even contemplating Ed Miliband's return. Someone damagingly referred to Keir Starmer as Ed Miliband without the Riz to me a few weeks ago. Not a quote I've used in this piece, but it stuck with me from a previous piece. And they sort of think, well, we're the biggest cohort in the Labour Party. Why don't we have a crack ourselves? Now, clearly, the person who most thinks that is Al Carns himself, because he's seldom off social media, including over the weekend when this was all going pear-shaped. And Carns was in a pub, drinking his pint, looking like a normal bloke. You go on his social media, there's one of him looking very hot and sweaty and rugged, and he looks like he sort of climbs mountains and eats bears for breakfast, and he did a pull-up competition with some chap in the army and beat him and all that. So if what you want from your Labour leader is something a bit more rugged than Keir Starmer, he might be the answer. I think we're still waiting to learn what he really thinks and what he might distinctively offer. But what he can definitely say is, I've led things in difficult, led people, men in difficult circumstances, and there's always an appeal for a fresh face in politics, because the Milibands and the Burnhams and the Yvette Coopers and all of that crowd, some of whom are muttered about as caretaker leaders and all that kind of thing. John Healey, great, solid citizen, the Defence Secretary, not a man who's going to set any man's pulse racing, no no knickers being thrown at him by the fairer sex. Whereas dear old Al Carns, clearly fancies himself as the kind of chap that men would like to be and women would like to be with.
What about Shabana Mahmood? Is she going to throw her hat into the ring?
Well, I think clearly there are people who ideologically disagree with Shabana Mahmood's approach on migration, but I think most people who have anything approaching a balanced view think she's by a distance the most able cabinet minister, and if they could click their fingers and hope that the Labour Party accepted her, they would make her the leader tomorrow. Clearly, she's not that popular with the soft left, which lives in a world where it's still sort of fascistic to contemplate controlling migration, when even half of all Green Party voters think it's a good idea, nearly 6 out of 10 Lib Dems and more than 7 out of 10 Labour supporters. So she's actually much more mainstream. If you could have said to Morgan McSweeney, be honest, mate, who would you like to run at the next election? He would have said Shabana Mahmood. But that, I don't think, is going to happen. I think she thinks that the Labour Party, I know she said to someone, this will never be the leader of the Labour Party, which is a damning indictment of the fact that, the Tory party has had more women and an ethnic minority leader, and the Labour Party has had neither so far. So I think she's probably, along with Miliband, one of the key sort of swing votes. If someone got both of their support, they would be in a very strong position. Angela Rayner and Wes Streeting will both be trying to line up the support of Mahmood, who is the best of them, and Miliband, who with the left is the most popular of them. But we'll see. And stranger things have happened, and some newbie coming through. Don't forget when David Cameron's campaign started back in 2005, I think the supporters famously could fit in one London black cab, and he went from months of irrelevance into storming to victory through his own abilities. So if Carns is good, we will see more of him. If he's not, he will join a long list of folk, including John Moore, Maggie Thatcher's health secretary, Sajid Javid, Brian Gould was talked about in the 90s as a sort of potential Labour. These are all leaders we never had. Carns is likely to be a leader we never had. But if he's any good, he will start to be someone we see a lot more of.
Guto, talking of the Tories, the political column this week, written by James Hill, says that Kemi is turning the tide. He says it's been a good few weeks for her, and he says that her position as leader is now seen as secure. Do you think that's right?
I think credit where credit's due, yes. Two things have happened. A, the positioning has gone back to being a party that talks about growing the economy, balancing the books, creating the genuine wealth out of which you can fund better public services, rather than a party that is looking wistfully at reform, thinking, but we believe the same as you, trying to be a pale imitation of reform with a woman who spent most of her early years in Nigeria. It's not going to work, and it's not the right thing to do, and it's not what most traditional, long-standing Conservatives and the people they attract when the party has been in power want. But she's also raised her game just on a professional competence level. She has done a very good job. I think the budget was a good display for all of us of just good parliamentary performance. And she's been quite forensic, weirdly, at the game that Keir Starmer should be best at, prosecuting. She's been very good, like a legal prosecutor over the last few weeks. Now, that makes for a far better opposition, which is good for democracy. I think she also survives the May elections, which will be pretty ghastly for the Conservatives as well as for Labour. I used to think 6 months ago, definitely 9 months ago, that she and Keir would be out together. I now think she survives, but Keir probably goes. Whether she's the right person to offer as a potential Prime Minister, I think the jury's still out on that. But I think she's gone from being Iain Duncan-Smith, dare I say, that takes the party to an even worse place than it was, to being Michael Howard, to bring the party back to a position of professionalism and credibility. And she deserves a lot of credit for that, as does the team around her, I think, who've worked extremely hard.
I'm a Kemi loyalist. She put me in the Lords.
She did.
She's a fairy godmother. So she waved a wand and here I am. But I think I agree. And not only is she getting the day-to-day stuff right, she's also, I think, getting the bigger strategic stuff right. So I think her policy positioning unveiled at the Tory party conference, I think everyone agrees she had a good conference on coming out of the European Convention, repealing the Human Rights Act, abandoning net zero by 2050, all good, sensible, strategic decisions. But most importantly, I think positioning the party as fiscally responsible seems like a really good way of differentiating it, not just from Labour and the Lib Dems and the Greens, but also from Reform. And if the government is going to now take a soft left turn, likelihood is the bond markets are going to revolt, the country's finances are going to be plunged into an even more tumultuous state. And so being seen as the only fiscally responsible party will be an electoral asset.
I wanted to move us on to Andrew Lownie's Royal Notebook. He has written about the struggles that he came across when trying to publish about Andrew. And he talks about nervous lawyers, and he's talking about reinstating stuff into his upcoming book. Tim, is that something that you've experienced as well when you've been writing books?
I've had the odd nervous lawyer. I mean, you self-censor to a degree. There are some things that will only ever appear if I write a novel rather than a non-fiction book, because it's spending time with lawyers is a rather tedious process. But yeah, it is a measure of how extraordinary all this Epstein stuff is that, Andrew Lownie, excellent, digger, proper historian, writer of books, had a lot of evidence, and the lawyers bottled it. Little did they know there was an absolute torrent of this stuff sitting there. And, most of what he had uncovered and was unable to print, he will now be able to print because it's all there. And I think, this is one of the most astonishing caches of sort of information that we've ever had in terms of the number of people who've been sucked into it and the sort of level of appalling detail that lies within. And I think actually it's almost a sort of weird time capsule because it's into the period where email exists and it's before the period where everyone realises that you shouldn't put anything controversial in an email. So it's almost like this sort of sweet spot.
A golden age.
A golden age of filth. And I'll certainly be buying the updated version of Andrew Lownie's book.
Sounds great.
I had to make a judgment call recently because I discovered in the Epstein files, going through them, I think I was searching for Graydon Carter's name. And quite a few entries. That took some time to go through all of those. But came across a mention of him in quite a long essay, an 8,500-word essay by Michael Wolff, who sometime contributed to The Spectator, written now a 3-volume biography of Trump, a brilliant chronicler of the kind of plutocratic elite in contemporary America. A fantastic essay by him, written about 10 years ago, about Jeffrey Epstein, in which he got extraordinary access, interviewed Epstein, hung out at his New York apartment, I think even accompanied on a trip to Miami, and talks about all the various billionaires paying court to Epstein, in spite of the fact that at that point he'd already, pleaded guilty to child sexual offences. So why, sort of the kind of the persistent question that Wolff kind of worries away at in the essay is, why weren't these billionaires put off by this seemingly toxic figure? Why did they continue to pay court? Why were they completely unfazed by the risks? And names lots of people who seemingly were quite close to Epstein. And of course I had to decide, well, can I risk publishing this? And just because it's been published by the Department of Justice in America, effectively put on their website, doesn't mean that you can't be sued for libel in the UK for publishing it, because our libel laws are famously a lot less permissive than America's libel laws. But, is Peter Thiel going to sue the Daily Skeptic, where I published this essay, and draw attention to the fact that he appears more than 2,000 times in the Epstein files, or will he probably let it slide, particularly given that it's been published by the Justice Department? And there's also a second question too, which was various passages in this essay had been redacted by the Justice Department, and Michael, who I asked permission from to publish it, he said, if you want, I can tell you what's in all those redacted passages, and sent me all the material, says if you want to unredact it. And I thought about putting the unredacted stuff behind a paywall, but in the end I thought that would be too risky.
So you published the redacted version?
We published the redacted version. I thought, I don't want the Department of Justice coming after me. They probably had good reason for redacting some of these passages. I'm not going to risk that. But I did risk being sued for libel by some of the people mentioned in the essay. So far, haven't had a letter.
Feel free to share the full version.
Exactly. Maybe after watching this, you might. One of the points that Andrew makes is that we need more transparency when it comes to the royal family. Guto, what do you make of that?
Well, I think in the case of Andrew, the king has distanced the rest of the family from him, but he's still living in luxury on a country estate, riding horses and no doubt shooting and fishing and whatever else he likes to do. But that's kind of by the by. What I don't understand is why nobody has tried to summon him to appear before a select committee to explain himself, for instance, and why the police don't now go and investigate, as they have with Mandelson. They move pretty quickly once there are allegations of breaking market rules, where there are similar allegations, shall we say, that not a million miles from Andrew if the lawyers to sort of allow that. So I think at this point, what should happen now is not more revelations and, this voyeuristic sort of fascination that we have with all of this, but action in the name of the victims in order to sort of execute justice. And then the story that he's writing is, what was all of this about? Who was behind it? How did Epstein manage to sort of create this, web of extortion, essentially, so that he had leverage over some of the richest and most powerful people in the world? What was that for? What was the object of the exercise? And what, the right question, why did they go long? Did they really go because they were having fun? Did they go because other people were there they wanted to hang out with? That's more understandable. But what was in it for Epstein? What was behind this? And all the allegations about the secret services of foreign countries and all that is what the Pulitzer Prize should go for, I think. So go forth.
Well, we'll do our best. But I think if Epstein was getting a tenth as much out of some of these very well plugged in people as he was getting out of Peter Mandelson, then he would have made a very large sum of money from that, regardless of whether Russia or Israel or anybody else was putting him up to it.
I'm going to move us on to Mary Wakefield's piece. She has written this week about the craze for adults buying children's toys, whether it be Lego or these Jellycat toys.
Is it a coincidence that we're talking about infantile men?
Well, I was just thinking Andrew, teddy bears.
I
was going to try and segue that way, but Toby, were you surprised to read that there's such a booming market for adult children's toys?
Yeah, quite surprised. I remember a really good essay by Peter York about 25 years ago called something like Kidland, and it was about a certain generation of baby boomers who kind of were obsessed with their own childhoods and recreating their own childhoods and lived in this kind of infantile world. I've got 4 children and they're now all teenagers. I've just got one final one who's 17, about to be 18. So apart from him, they're all adults. So my wife and I spend an enormous amount of time chucking out children's toys. My wife is always screaming at me to go to the dump with a kind of boot full of children's toys. Now I've read this piece, I realise that there could be a market for these
absolutely.
toys. So I'm now going to put them on eBay and see how far I go.
Tim, were you surprised?
I mean, I'm not that surprised because I've seen a bit of it. I know, some of my wife's friends who cleave a little more closely than you would imagine to the Jellycat kind of world of you go and see their houses, and if they're between love affairs, suddenly all this stuff comes out again as a comforting thing. And I have male friends who spend literally hundreds of pounds on sort of vintage Lego and get very excited about making, the Saturn V rocket or whatever. I've not succumbed to it myself. I mean, I've got young kids, so there's plenty of Lego in the house to keep me occupied as I assist them in their construction of the latest Frozen castle or whatever it is. But no, I waste all my money on first edition books, I'm afraid. So I'm slightly past Jellycats and Lego, but it's... Yeah, there's more than a bit of it around in the sort of periphery of my life.
I clocked a while ago that a lot of adults were into colouring. And that's sort of weird in a way. I can see that you zone out, you focus on something, and maybe it's just like doing a Sudoku, which I do. But
it's a bit like creating London buses out of old crates.
You could argue that's more artistic.
What sort of loser would do that?
But I'm drawn a bit to Lego. I haven't actually bought any Lego for decades and decades, but I do if I walk past a Lego shop and I see,
You start to twitch.
Yes. It's sort of, I've never been into jigsaw puzzles nor indeed board games, but I used to love Lego. And there is something about how you can construct something and there is a happy ending to it. And maybe that's what is at play here, deep
Back to
down.
Epstein now.
I'm going to say, I'm not sure I'd be talking about happy endings in a week like this. But anyway.
Mary mentions this concept of curling parenting, which is essentially removing any friction in the way of your children. Toby, what do you make of that as an idea? Is that something you've practiced?
I've certainly encountered helicopter parenting, which sounds like the same thing, and always thought it was a mistake to try and ease your children's passage into the world and protect them from any kind of conflict or challenge. In the What the Coddling of the American Mind by Haidt and God, I can't remember their names. I was talking about Jonathan Haidt and Greg Lukianoff. They say that one of the reasons for the free speech crisis in American universities, and probably our universities too, is that a generation has become so accustomed to living in this frictionless world that they interpret any kind of challenge, any kind of obstacle or conflict as a microaggression or as a source of potential mental distress and anxiety, and so are completely averse to it, and so want to live in these kind of cocoon, cotton-wooled, safe spaces where they're overprotected. And I think there must be some. Initially, I thought, no, they just dress up their fragility. They just try and weaponize their psychological fragility to kind of prosecute their ideological agenda and to shut down dissent. And I think there's an element of that. But actually, having looked after lots of people now who've been kind of targeted for cancellation in universities via the Free Speech Union, I now think there's something in it. I do think that the current, generation of students are quite fragile. They have been brought up in a kind of cocooned universe, and they do interpret any kind of conflict or challenge as a real threat.
And they need their jellycats.
Yeah, I mean, it was my daughter's 7th birthday yesterday, and I've always sort of tried to give my daughters sort of resilience and tell them to sort of crack on. It was quite interesting. 2 of the boys who were there cried more than the girls when things didn't go their way. One of them ran off to the hallway and sort of hit the floor and started screaming because things. And I had to go off and sort of, I'll be honest, I had a bit of a chat with him and sort of said, these girls being mean to you. I mean, this is going to be life, my friend. You need to man up. And whether he got that conversation at home, I don't know. But he seemed sort of taken by. I said, I'm bullied by my daughters, by my wife. I bet your mum bullies your dad. Oh yes, she does. He said, and we suddenly bonded, and he was fine then. And off he went back to demand a second portion of cake. But unless you sort of teach kids that the world is not necessarily going to roll in their direction, you're really setting them up to fail, as Toby says.
The Deborah Ross review this week of Wuthering Heights describes it as a teenage sex dream, and I know that obviously the film is already dividing critics. Toby, will you be watching it?
I think probably not. I did quite enjoy Saltburn, the same director's last film, but this sounds not really my cup of tea. I've noticed the kind of spread of what we might call kind of borderline soft porn in mainstream costume drama like Bridgerton. And I have to say, it does skeeve me out a little bit, particularly if I'm watching it with my wife or my children. And I'm not kind of precious about not being faithful to the classics. I mean, one of the great things about the classics, particularly Shakespeare, is how susceptible they are to reinterpretation. And, that's why they continue to live. So I don't mind that, and I don't mind, colourblind casting, anything like that. But the kind of introduction of kind of oodles of sex as a way of trying to sell it and trying to pass that off as kind of edgy and risque that sticks in my craw.
I
mean, I wasn't planning to watch it, but if it's full of oodles and sex, I might make an exception. I'm just wondering whether Guto's planning another of his happy endings.
Well, you don't need to go behind, not a paywall, but a VPN, actually, to watch this. This is your other avenues have been shut down. I've just seen a film this week that's very disturbing, but it was basically No Other Choice, and it was one of these Asian films where a guy who's lost his job is finding it so hard, and there's the dignity as well as earning money for the family and all that, and there's a risk of having to move house, that he actually finds out who else is on the shortlist of a job he really needs to get because it's the last attempt. And he literally goes in search of them and kills each one of them. So, it's sort of, there's nothing joyful and sexy about any of that, but it's haunting me because there are so many big themes in it. And
once AI kicks in, we're probably going to have to, people going around pruning for the last job available.
Exactly. It's sort of...
Toby, your column this week is from the gym. You've written about how vain people seem to be in the gym, but also how rude they seem to be. When did that begin, do you think?
Well, yeah, I used to be a bit of a gym rat in the 90s, but then getting married, having children, having quite a big workload paid to all that. But I recently started taking Manjaro about 6 months ago. And my wife said, well, on one condition, and that is that you don't let your muscles atrophy, which is one of the potential side effects. So I started going to the gym. And it's my first time really going back to the gym in 20, 25 years. And one thing that's really noticeable is that everyone is on their phones constantly. Now, that you'd kind of expect, but what was a surprise to me is how many people sit on machines in between sets on their phones for like literally half an hour as kind of cues form of people wanting to use the equipment. I mean, the extraordinary lack of kind of awareness of any kind of consideration. And it's partly because everyone now is in the gym in their own little worlds. They've often got AirPods in. And if I go up to, particularly a young woman sitting on a machine, doom scrolling TikTok, and say, do you mind if I work in? I'm not even sure that's a phrase these days. 20 years ago, everyone knew what that meant. I mean, can I have a turn, please? You've been sitting on here for too long. And they now give me a dirty look, as if I'm trying to
I think you're hitting on them.
I think they think, because they can't hear what I'm saying, because they've got the AirPod. So they have to switch off their phone, take up the and say, what? And then you have to repeat it, and they don't understand what you mean. And if you ask to take a turn, they look really put out. And I think it's because, gym life is now much more atomized, less social. The only respect in which it is social is people filming themselves in the gym to then post on their socials, if they think they're fitness influencers or something. It's all very well to have a conversation with strangers, provided they can't talk back. So they create reels, post them, but they won't talk to anyone in the gym. And the lovely thing, I think, about going to the gym back in the 90s was you could go up to a complete stranger and say, do you mind if I work in? He wouldn't mind, and he would then say, would you like me to spot you? These are probably phrases which no one understands now, but that meant
I very rarely go to
if you're kind of bench pressing, 50 kilograms, would you like me to help you with the last 3 or 4 reps? And often you would say, yes, thank you, and you'd trust a complete stranger.
And then you go for a drink.
One thing leads to another.
But so life in gyms these days is a lot less friendly and a lot less social.
I'm risking my muscles atrophy. It's fair to say.
Finally, I just wanted to mention our notes on hairpieces. There was obviously that story recently of the boxer and his hairpiece flying off.
Toby, tell us about hairpieces.
Do you have any thoughts on hairpieces?
Yeah, I did see that footage, and it was hard to avoid it, of the boxer having his hairpiece kind of knocked up like a door on a hinge, and I did feel sorry for him. I remember in New York once, as a piece for a men's magazine, doing a story in which I went to 10 different nightclubs and used 10 different pickup lines from the book How to Pick Up Girls, which are, it's not, I wouldn't recommend it as a pickup manual, but I tried out these 10 pickup lines in 10 different nightclubs over the course of an evening, went back the following evening with a wig on, as designed by a kind of Hollywood wig maker. It was like a $10,000 wig that they'd created for the purpose of this article to see if I had any more success, with a wig on. Is it true that women supposedly are indifferent to whether men have hair or not, even find bald men sexy, or do they actually prefer men with hair? Turns out, surprise, surprise, they do prefer men with hair, and I was actually a lot more successful with the wig on than I was with the wig off. So I've done the science. And but as a general rule, and I tell my children this, all my boys, particularly one of them, are losing their hair in their kind of late teens, early 20s. And it's a source of some anxiety. And my wife sometimes urges them to look at going to Turkey for kind of transplants. But my view is, better it happens early than late, and just embrace it. Shave your head, make it look like a choice. Get used to it, much better than trying to fussing about it and worrying about it for the rest of your life. The poor guy who wrote this particular piece said he used to go in for a comb-over before he embraced his baldness, and was terrified when there was a sort of gust of wind that it would blow it out of place. That way perdition lies.
He's right. In normal life, if your hair is going short as possible, my father had sort of tufts of it, like there's a terrible look. But in politics, much more difficult. Iain Duncan-Smith, William Hague, all these bald people, they don't get on very well, which is why David Cameron had a huge bald spot like this, and he used to grow his hair and then do a sort of back flap like that. Donald Trump, who I've interviewed, again, almost totally bald down the middle, grows it really long, winds it round his head, and then sprays, and it looks ridiculous, but it doesn't look worse than not having it. And it seems to matter to politicians. And you can always tell when someone's going for a leadership thing, because they suddenly start paying a lot of money for their hair to be done.
Berlusconi many years ago as the Rome correspondent of the BBC, and he's about that high compared to me. And the papers in Italy at the time were full of allegations that he had moved hair from an intimate part of his body to his head. And literally, at the angle I had, there was no doubt at all that that's what had happened. And then you think, this is absolutely disgusting. This little wiry stuff is on his forehead. And I just think, is that really better than just embracing it? My hairline, unfortunately, is like my lawn. Gets slightly better in spring, but, it's, the coverage is patchy. But you've got to live with it.
Toby, Guto, Tim, thank you very much for joining.